Hello, I'm Kenneth Marcus, chairman of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today on anti-Semitism in the workplace. This is part of our continuing initiative to shine a light on anti-Semitism in the corporate workplace. As many of you are aware, the Louis D. Brandeis Center, founded over a decade ago, has focused most of its efforts on campus anti-Semitism, which remains our number one priority as we consider the American college campus to be a primary place in which anti-Semitism has been fought. But in recent years, we've been increasingly concerned about reports of anti-Semitism affecting workers in the United States, including both anecdotal information like employees who are reporting problems to us, and also surveys showing disturbingly high rates of anti-Semitism within the US workplace. For that reason, we have been focused this year also on corporate anti-Semitism, and I'm pleased today that we have an expert webinar featuring three prominent people who each have really a separate but important focus area that's related to this issue. Holly Huffnagle, having significant expertise on the nature of anti-Semitism. Craig Leen on broadly religious discrimination affecting government contractors, which are a significant part of the workplace. And Jonathan Segal on anti-Semitism and religious discrimination in the workforce, including U.S. anti-discrimination laws. Holly Huffnagle, who is going to speak first, is the American Jewish Committee's U.S. Director for Combating Anti-Semitism. She spearheads the AJC's response to anti-Semitism in the United States and its effort to better protect the Jewish community. Now, before she was at AJC, she served as policy advisor to the special envoy to monitor and combat global anti-Semitism, and also had a senior position at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Jonathan Segal is a partner at Duane Morris LLP in its employment group. He also heads the Duane Morris Institute, which provides business-focused training to HR professionals, in-house counsel, and other leaders on a myriad of employment issues. Over the last couple of years, Jonathan's work has expanded materially with respect to religious discrimination, religious freedom, and inclusion issues. He represents both secular and religious organizations. Within this space, that is to say, within the issue of religious discrimination, his primary interest lately, or primary focus, has been anti-Semitism. In addition to helping clients, Jonathan has delivered a number of talks on anti-Semitism for both the EEOC and the Society of Human Resource Managers, and as co-presenters presented with EEOC commissioners and AJC global leaders. Craig Leen is a partner in K&L Gates's Washington, D.C. office. He's a member of the Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group and co-heads the firm's OFCCP and Affirmative Action Compliance area focus. Before he joined the firm, he was the head of the U.S. Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or OFCCP, a small but very important organization which ensures non-discrimination among government contractors, who, as I mentioned, are a very large and important part of corporate America. In that position, he reported directly to the Secretary of Labor. He supervised about 450 employees and a budget north of $100 million. So each of these experts has a very important but discrete and separate role in understanding the problem that we're looking at today, which is anti-Semitism within the corporate world. We're going to start with Holly Huffnagle, who, as I mentioned, is an expert on anti-Semitism at the American Jewish Committee. Holly?
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to the Louis D. Brandeis Center for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a pleasure to be with you and my esteemed panelists and to really discuss this topic of growing concern. And what I want to do with my time is really set the stage for Jonathan and Craig and start by sharing what the state of anti-Semitism in America looks like today, and how that is actually seeping into the workplace, affecting American Jews, and where we need to go, what we should be doing with companies and Jewish employees and allied coworkers in this moment. And there are a couple of things happening right now. One, anti-Semitism is rising. We know this at least from the past few years, if not before. And second, companies, workplaces in recent years have become more active in entering social justice spaces, even political spaces. 10, 15, 20 years ago, this really was not the case. This corporate outspokenness, if you will, this corporate involvement is relatively new and a reflection of the workforce, even the younger workforce in many ways. So we have to remember these two pieces. I'll come back to them. So if we first look at anti-Semitism in America and what we know the vast majority of American Jews think that anti-Semitism is a problem in the US. We also know that they say it's increased in the last 5 years. We know American Jews are experiencing anti-Semitism. Last year, 1 in 4 American Jews reported being personally targeted by anti-Semitism. And we know that they're also changing their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. In fact, 4 in 10 American Jews changed their behavior last year in some way, and at least once. Either they didn't wear something that would identify them as Jewish, maybe they didn't go to a Jewish institution, or they avoided posting something online that would reveal their Jewish identity or how they think about Jewish issues. Again, all out of fear of anti-Semitism. We also know that Americans, US adults, are seeing anti-Semitism. In fact, 4 in 10, 40% of US adults reported seeing anti-Semitism last year, and over 30% reported seeing it more than once. So again, we're seeing some of this trend. And it was only a matter of time when those two tracks that I mentioned earlier, rising anti-Semitism and that corporate outspokenness, would come to a head. And it happened. During and following the Hamas-instigated war between Gaza and Israel in May of 2021, the U.S. experienced at least an 80% increase in anti-Semitism. I've seen numbers even higher than that, but at least an 80% increase. And for many American Jews, we asked them, hearing about these anti-Semitic attacks actually made them feel less safe as a Jewish person in the United States. But whereas companies, which had spoken out rightfully about the Me Too movement, trying to support women, about Black Lives Matter, offering resources and support for Black employees, having programs and resources on the importance of stopping Asian hate. In May 2021, as Jews were being attacked on the streets of New York, Los Angeles, as Jewish institutions were vandalized across the US, we saw many social media harassment campaigns across platforms targeting pro-Israel Jews. Unfortunately, these companies were silent. Maybe they didn't know what to do. And for those who did speak out, there were a few companies who did speak out. They weren't unequivocal about anti-Semitism. Instead, they would list anti-Semitism amongst a laundry list of other hateful isms when it was just the Jewish community who was targeted. And that's when the calls started coming in for AJC, for American Jewish Committee. I know for other Jewish organizations as well. We had been doing trainings for several years on anti-Semitism for government leaders, for the FBI, for our interreligious partners. But the tide shifted and the asks and concerns started coming in from Jewish employees. A few quotes come to mind, such as, my company doesn't know what to do. Or how can I go to my company with these concerns? They don't even know what anti-Semitism is. Someone shared, I'm asked my position now on Israel because I'm Jewish. Someone else had said that they were trying to start up a employee resource group and were told that they had to be in the interfaith umbrella. But this was someone who was a Jewish person, but who was atheist, and said, my company doesn't get that. I don't want to be in an interfaith umbrella. And so this is what we were hearing, kept coming. And so as we entered these corporate spaces, we discovered a few things. We found that many Americans in leadership positions, especially in corporate America, continue to view anti-Semitism through a religious lens, and therefore a topic that does not need to be addressed within a diversity, equity, inclusion, within a DEI, D&I framework. We also found that people, relatedly, they don't actually really know who Jews are. So we actually had to start by explaining who Jews are so they would then know what anti-Semitism is. And that it should be actually discussed within DE&I contexts. And we've done major trainings now for global firms. And we start by sharing that Jews are a people, an ethno-religious group, nation, tribe originating in the land of Israel. We share that the majority practice Judaism or are at least culturally associated with Jewish traditions, but others are not. That many Jews are atheists or not religious, but they're still Jews. And we share how the word Jew comes from the word Judea, the ancient name for Israel. We also expand on Jewish diversity and note that Jews are not only European Ashkenazi Jews, but there are Black Jews from Ethiopia, Brown Jews from India, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from North Africa and Turkey, from Iraq and Iran. And we show how presuming that Jews are just quote unquote white and therefore privileged has led to anti-Semitism being completely overlooked in these spaces. And then we talk about anti-Semitism, and we note how it's not just a hatred or a prejudice, but a conspiracy. And that is why it is different from other forms of racism, which vilify their victims as inferior. Now, of course, we do history, and we talk about the history of being vilified as inferior and how that continues. But we really focus today in these conversations with companies on how anti-Semitism is unique because it perceives its target, Jews, as being quote unquote superior, as having too much privilege, too much power, and attacks them for that. And we talk about how there's a large blind spot in today's society, even within company culture, when it comes to anti-Semitism, because here we have a minority who is assailed because of their perceived power. And then we show how anti-Semitism works, which many people don't know, that it's not linear. It ebbs and it flows, as we've seen throughout Jewish history. And just because Jews are maybe in a comfortable position, maybe they are assimilated today, we know from history that that's not a guarantee for safety. So we work with human resource departments, with DEI professionals to help them understand hostile work environments for Jews, which can be connected to Israel, such as when Jewish employees are asked to condemn Israel or explain Israeli actions just because they are Jewish. And we utilize our recently published call to action against anti-Semitism in America that really tries to focus on so many different sectors of society and what they can be doing. And we have a whole section on corporate responsibility, and we'll share the link with you to this piece. And I actually want to thank my co-panelist, Jonathan Segal, for his contribution to this section, because this is in this call to action, we ask companies to address anti-Semitism first through recognizing it, including utilizing useful educational tools such as the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, as well as a glossary of anti-Semitic terms and tropes called Translate Hate, which we'll share as well. Second, by responding to it, ensuring that anti-Semitism is called out unambiguously and unequivocally, and how to honor the progressive principle of allyship and actually listen to the lived experiences of Jewish coworkers. And then third and finally, we are working with companies now on what they can be doing, what mechanisms they can be putting in place on prevention, not just on recognition and response, but prevention. How can they be ready for the patterns? We know anti-Semitism rises when there's an uptick in violence in the Middle East or around Jewish holidays, and companies can be prepared to check in on their Jewish employees. They can ensure that anti-Semitism and Jewish diversity and inclusion is foundational within DE&I to help prevent incidents of anti-Semitism or unconscious bias in the workplace. Establishing employee resource groups for Jewish employees, educating about Jewish holidays and not presuming that a Jewish person in the workplace will speak up to ask for that Jewish holiday off, and how being a good ally means not placing the burden on them to constantly raise the issue. And then most importantly and finally, Jewish employees must be on board and involved. And if I'm honest, like this whole process, it's quite new, it's quite slow, and that's okay because it should also be done right. And we're learning, we're still learning. And in fact, in our upcoming survey, AJC publishes an annual State of Anti-Semitism in America report where we look at experiences with anti-Semitism by American Jews. We asked about anti-Semitism in the workplace for the first time. This report's coming out in the next few weeks. And we asked American Jews who are employed if they have ever avoided expressing their views on Israel in their workplace or with colleagues. We asked them if they've ever avoided wearing or displaying something that would identify them as Jewish, if they've ever experienced difficulty taking time off work or told they couldn't for a Jewish holiday, and if they ever felt uncomfortable or unsafe in their workplace because of their Jewish identity. And so that information is forthcoming. We'll be able to share that with all of you as well in the next few weeks. And that's also going to greatly inform our work ahead. So I'll stop here. I think I'm at my 10 minutes. Ken, thank you for this opportunity. And I look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Holly. And we'll look forward to speaking further with you later in the hour. To our distinguished audience, and I see we do have a distinguished audience, variety of different professionals and academics, scholars in different fields. I'm seeing humanities, social sciences, law, at least one recent former university president. To the audience, I would say that if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A chat, which we'll look at later in the hour. But for now, thanking Holly, we will turn next to Jonathan Segal.
I want to thank the Brandeis Center and Mr. Marcus in particular, and Holly, it's nice to see you. We are seeing an increase of anti-Semitism in the workplace. I represent companies, and we're getting more complaints raised by employees. Is it to the level of Me Too? No, but are employees beginning to assert their concerns? And many are by Jewish employees, but not all are by Jewish employees. We'll talk more about that. We're seeing, I'm going to talk about 4 categories very briefly, and each one of these could be an hour: discrimination, harassment, failure to accommodate, and failure to acknowledge. And I just want to spend one moment, because I hope it builds on what Holly said, and I know I've heard from the Brandeis Center. I think DEI started appropriately, understandably, with gender, race, and ethnicity. But like all good things, it needs to grow. And if it's going to evolve and grow, it needs to include age, disability, and religion, including anti-Semitism. In many organizations, there has been appropriate vocal condemnation of other isms or silence on anti-Semitism. And people ask me the question sometimes, well, is silence complicity here? Well, if you're asking the question, then I think you need to do something about it. You may want to draw may have criteria when you draw the line on you speaking out on public issues. But if you're drawing the line with anti-Semitism, people are going to notice that's where the line has been drawn. And as Holly also said, sometimes it's a sandwich, sometimes it's very, very general. Just we condemn bigotry. And there have been some high-profile cases where people who have condemned anti-Semitism have been required to retract it or criticized for engaging in discriminatory conduct for condemning anti-Semitism. Now, that's just nuts in and of itself, but so is anti-Semitism. So I think there's an existential, Jewish employees, from an existential sense, need to know we belong and need to feel they have a place. And if you can't condemn the reality of anti-Semitism, you can't go beyond that and look at inclusion. So I want to just mention that as a starting point. In terms of discrimination, as Holly said, many people who identify as Jewish may not be ritualistic, but feel culturally very connected to the Jewish people. And that's not surprising for that reason, that individuals in the workplace, applicants or employees, may be protected not only based on religion under Title VII, but also potentially based on national origin, race, or even genetic information. I could spend a lot of time on that. I won't, but I will mention that when you look at it and you break it down further, let's look at discrimination. Just when employers do training, when employers take preventive steps, when employers monitor and take corrective action, employers need to look at conscious anti-Semitism. I don't want someone working for me because the conspiracy theory, vermin less than, but controlling at the same time. Jews cannot be trusted, another trope. We got to focus on those issues. We need to deal with stereotyping, comments about Jewish employees. And sometimes people think they're making a compliment. I want a Jewish lawyer. Well, you may want a lawyer who's Jewish, but that won't be me unless you tell me what you're looking for. And let's talk about attributes. And that's discriminatory, not only toward Jewish people, but also Gentiles who may be stronger. So these quote positive stereotypes, there's nothing positive about them. And then implicit bias, which we hear a lot about, and by its terms, people aren't aware of it. But we know when people hear based on appearance or based on name, people make associations, potentially with someone being Jewish, and that may come with a negative view. Implicit bias trainings historically have been silent on anti-Semitism. I like giving people in general, organizations in general, the benefit of the doubt. But what is implicit may be conscious when the issue has been brought to conscious awareness if it's not addressed. And that's where we are, I think, now, not to address anti-Semitism and discrimination training, not to address an implicit bias, to me is a statement in and of itself. Two common defenses that I hear for people not addressing it. One, Holly talked about it already, the potential power and privilege of Jews, which in and of itself is a discriminatory comment, because even if a group as a whole is doing well, that doesn't mean everyone is. Even if a group as a whole is doing well, that doesn't mean an individual isn't suffering from discrimination or harassment. So we need to be very careful not to apply a model minority myth to Jews. We see it applied often to Asian Americans and ignore the issue. And the fact that there may be, I said to someone, not in a workplace setting, I was going to get involved in something. And the person said to me, don't even try. The last thing they need is another Jewish lawyer. And I said, well, help me understand why you think that. And they said, well, because this organization said that. There would have been a time where I would have said, I find that hard to believe, but I don't anymore. Sadly, some direct bias is scantily clad in equity, and we need to be careful that that doesn't happen. Then there's reasonable accommodations. We could spend 2 hours, but just I want to hit that it would include, for example, personal protective equipment, working hours, working days. And there is a perception by some, an observation that sometimes I see, that concerns or requests for accommodations may not be treated quite the same way if they're raised by Jewish employees. After all, you have such power and privilege. I'm not saying that. I'm echoing what's the thought out or implicit understanding. Why do we need to accommodate further? Always a good idea when you get accommodations to ask yourself the question, have I had requests like this before? Similar, same or similar, for a same or similar position, and how have I handled it? That kind of comparative question can maximize consistency and minimize potential unconscious bias. And then harassment. The legal definition under federal law, at least, it's severe or pervasive. California, New York City, other places, it's a easier standard. I can't imagine any organization waiting for it to reach a legal level before they stop it. I can't imagine any employee having to wait. So I would encourage organizations to not only look at discrimination, number one, make sure religion is in their accommodation policies. I often see disability, but not religion, belief, practice, observance. And number three, integrate examples of anti-Jewish bias in their anti-harassment policy, training, and corrective action. Because sometimes people don't know what harassing conduct is. And I just want to say, of course, it includes the obvious things like hate symbols, such as a swastika or the K word. But it also can be comments about Jewish wealth or power. It can be comments blaming Jews for world problems, including asking incessant questions about the Middle East, Holocaust denial, trivialization, or jokes. I mentioned to someone that I was fortunately not with whom I work, or would have made it a much more difficult situation, that I was going, and thank you, AJC, with AJC to the Holocaust commemoration at the UN next Friday. And someone said, how long is that card going to continue to be played? And not someone I know well, not someone I particularly want to know more, But if I had to work with them, that would be an uncomfortable situation for me. And Holly talked about education. 10% of millennials and Gen Z know very little, according to the Claims Conference report, about the Holocaust. Even more disturbing, 10% when asked in a national survey said that Jews were, I see if I can the exact words, Jews were to be blamed for the Holocaust. So the need for education on these issues is really important. And then I'll just end with the elephant in some of the training living room, which is avoiding Israel, which number one is erasing a very large part of the Jewish community. I was thinking about this today. I try to be honest to myself. Sometimes it's hard. I wear a chai. I'll wear it till I die. It's my grandmother's symbol. For those who don't know, it means life, or effectively means life. I know that's not the exact translation. And I wear it, and I used to wear it beneath my shirt. Now I wear it outside. A few people said, is that pride, defiance? I'm like, how about not an or, maybe a little bit of an and? And I'm thinking, I'm not going to be coward, yet I'm really excited. This isn't a promo for AJC, but I'm really excited to go with AJC to Israel. And I've been less vocal about that in my own workplace. And although I don't feel it sometimes and don't like to acknowledge it, I have power. But yet I don't want to hear the questions. I don't want to hear all the comments. How can you support Israel? And I want to be clear on this because I think it's important. People can be critical of the Israeli government. For some Israelis, that's a full-time job. But if you make it the only thing you talk about, if you demonize the right of Israel to exist, then what happens to the multi-million people there? Delegitimization. If everything bad is analogized to Israel, that kind of demonization. And then the double standard, and I'm going to end with this and ask my panelists what they think, and people that are listening. For me, it's not that complicated when it comes to Israel. And as an employment lawyer, and Craig, maybe you have seen some of the same thought process or had some of the same thought process. If four people, I'm going to use the easiest example, misappropriated trade secrets. 3 were men and 1 was a woman. And the only person that was fired was the woman. I think we'd all say sexism. If there were 4 people that misappropriated trade secrets and 3 were white and 1 was of color, and the only person that was fired was a person of color, I think we would say racism. In my view, we can't compare Israel, my own view, to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But for a moment, let's just engage in what I think is false equivalency. You still have individuals that will ignore everything else and talk only about Israel. And that kind of double standard, which is discussed in the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, that's some of the stuff that we see in workplaces. That's some of the reasons why we hear about Jewish power and privilege. And I think if organizations want to do what's right, if employees want to help by speaking up, we need to address the ability for people to disagree on policy, but not denigrate, delegitimize, or apply a double standard to a people.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. As we prepare to welcome Craig Leen to speak, I just want to say a quick thank you to Craig. As some of you in the audience might have read our Brandeis Center fact sheet on religious accommodations in the workplace that we issued just last month. And one of the reasons that we issued it was to bring attention to important changes in the law, one of which is new protections for religious workers, including especially Jewish workers, at corporations that might have contracts with the federal government. Well, we have Craig Leen to thank for that. He was the director of the key agency, OFCCP, that issued that guidance, ensuring stronger protections against religious discrimination, including explicitly for Jewish Americans. So in addition to welcoming Craig to speak to us and share generously his expertise, I just wanted to give a thank you to Craig for what he has done to strengthen protections against religious discrimination and to help in the battle against anti-Semitism. Craig?
Thank you, Ken. It's such an honor to be here today with the Brandeis Center, with this very wonderful panel on such an important topic. I come here as the former OFCCP director, as an employment attorney, as the vice chair of the DC Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, although I'm not here in that capacity, and as an ally. I'm Roman Catholic. I'm the son of a Jewish father who I know is watching, and it's just a true honor to be here. I would like to echo first what's already been said. Anti-Semitism in the workplace is a significant problem. I can come to you as someone who's been the OFCCP director and who has collaborated with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and tell you that we have seen an increase in anti-Semitism in the workplace. The EOC last year passed a unanimous resolution, which you don't always see because it's a commission that has Democrats and Republicans, but they all agreed that anti-Semitism has increased and it's a serious, significant problem in the workplace. I'm reminded of that every day or at least weekly in Georgetown where I live. And I drive by the Catholic church that I attend and the Baptist church that's nearby, and there's no police outside. And yet I drive by the Jewish synagogue in Georgetown and there's police every weekend out there. And it shouldn't be that way in America. And we need to make sure it's not that way in the workplace. So I wanted to first let you all know that there are a lot of, as Ken mentioned, there are a lot of authorities and guidance documents available that say that anti-Semitism is completely inappropriate in the workplace, both based on religion and national origin, and also sometimes ethnicity, race, etc. And that it's something that's completely inappropriate. I wanted to draw, you're going to see in the chat a number of these links. Please take a look at them. I wanted to draw attention in particular to an opinion letter I issued in January of 2021, legal protections for religious liberty in the workplace. And it was in response to an organization that protected the workplace rights of Jewish Americans. They sent us an opinion letter asking about anti-Semitism in the workplace and about religious freedom and non-discrimination in the workplace. And this letter, I won't read you the whole letter, it's fairly long. And it talks about some of the legal authorities supporting religious accommodations and non-discrimination in the workplace. But I will read you the specific questions they asked. And part of me, I was glad they asked these questions because we could answer them and say this is discrimination. But part of me was sad that they had to be asked because you don't typically see questions like this having to be asked for other protected groups. So, for example, one question we received was, and this is all available on the internet, an applicant employee suffers an adverse employment action because an employer assumes the applicant employee has values that others may find offensive. For example, because he or she attended a religious private school, attends an Orthodox synagogue with a sex-segregated seating, or wears a hijab. Answer, based on the examples in the scenario, we assume that by values you mean religious values. Under that assumption, the adverse employment action would be a violation of the regulation. The second question, an applicant employee suffers an adverse employment action because he or she is a member of religion that has taken public policy positions that others may find offensive. By the way, I'm not saying that these should be offensive. This was the question we were asked. E.g., supporting or opposing the state of Israel or opposing late-term abortions. Again, we said the adverse employment action would be a violation of the regulations. Third, an applicant employee suffers an adverse employment action because during non-work hours, he or she attended or otherwise supported a synagogue, church-sponsored cause or event that others may find offensive. For example, an anti-war rally, the March for Life, or a rally opposing anti-Semitism. And again, we said, well, we're assuming that this is based on religion, and if so, that would be an adverse employment action, it would be a violation of the law. An employee suffers an adverse employment action because during a company-provided rest break, in which coworkers were discussing current events or social issues, something people do all the time. The employee stated that he or she has religious views that others may find offensive. For example, he or she believes in traditional marriage, or conversely supports an expanded definition of the family. Again, we found an adverse employment action would be illegal. Applicant employee suffers an adverse employment action because either during an interview or before first reporting to work, the employee informs the employer about a religious requirement that necessitates an accommodation, the inability to work on the Sabbath or other religious holy days, the need to have a personal microwave for kosher food. Accommodation like this is not granted because this is not going to cause typically an undue hardship. it would be discrimination. And then lastly, an applicant recently hired employee is let go because he or she requested an accommodation for religious observance, with no opportunity to discuss with the employer the reasons for the needed accommodation or possible solutions, like needing to leave work early on Friday afternoons in the winter to be home before the Sabbath begins at sundown. Again, we found that that would be discrimination. So the point is, I spent some time on that because, this is really a simple issue. You can't discriminate based on someone's religion. You can't discriminate because someone's Jewish. And if someone needs an accommodation to be able to participate in the workplace, it must typically be granted. Now, one point I would like to draw attention to, and I provided some other links that you should take a look at as well, relating to what companies and employers should be doing to fully include and incorporate people who are Jewish and people who are religious, practicing, or non-religious in the workplace fully. But I wanted to emphasize that, these protections and regulations, it was mentioned before about race discrimination, gender discrimination. They should be treated the same. Discrimination based on religion is just as odious and is something that needs to be eliminated. But it's true, I have to tell you, being at OFCCP and also now advising companies, that most diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility programs, as was mentioned by Holly, do not include anti-Semitism. They typically focus predominantly on race and gender, but they should include religion. They should include Jewish people. They should include religious practices. Now, I understand that you have to be very open about that and include all different religions, but in doing that, you need to make sure that you're not excluding practicing Jews or non-practicing Jews. You need to make sure to include them. I'd say about 95% of diversity, equity, inclusion programs only include race and gender and don't include these other groups. So it's something that you need to take to think about. But also, in terms of accommodations, you need to think about the fact that for a long time, and this was mentioned by Jonathan, that religious accommodations weren't viewed in the same way as disability accommodations, often not even in the handbook or included at all. And that's a real problem. You can't do that. It is true, I want to be honest, it is true that the legal standard for disability accommodations and religious accommodations is a little different, and that it's harder to deny disability discrimination. It shouldn't be that way, by the way. Both should be as high a standard, in my opinion. But that is the law. Having said that, it's not a low standard for religious accommodations. It's quite high. A lot of times people like to say, well, it has to be more than de minimis, the burden on the employer to deny it. But emphasize more than it can't be de minimis. It has to be significant. It has to be a significant hardship to the company to deny a religious accommodation. And the best companies should never deny religious accommodations because religious accommodations typically do not come with a cost, particularly for larger companies. Most religious accommodations have no specific cost. It's more of a change in policy. It's allowing someone to have a microwave. It's allowing someone to observe their Sabbath. Sometimes disability accommodations do come with a cost. Most don't, but some do. But religious accommodations rarely come with a cost, and they should generally be granted as a matter of course. And yet, I have to tell you, we would see discrimination based on denials of religious accommodations, and often it's to Jewish employees. That needs to stop. And it's important as companies to have proactive measures in place so that you have an accommodation system, a centralized one with experts that understand that accommodations generally need to be granted. That's a very pro diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility measure. And you should apply that equally to people with disabilities as well as to religious practicing individuals. I'll tell you, really, it's with the vaccine accommodations that for the first time, you've really seen religious accommodations come to the fore. And I have to tell you, and I'm very much in favor of vaccines. I want to be clear about that. But I have to tell you, I was distressed at the amount of discrimination and negative statements made about religious practicing individuals who needed to get accommodations and were attacked for that. I was also distressed for the disability community who may have needed accommodations as well. They were attacked as well. But the point is that you must follow the law as it relates to religious accommodations. That's important in building a workplace that's supportive of religious practicing individuals. So, I've spoken for about 10 minutes. I know I want to return it back to the panel, but I just wanted to emphasize again, it's an honor to be here. Second, I can speak with authority and with experience, having been the OFCCP director. This is a significant problem and it needs focus. It needs focus. We need to address anti-Semitism. We need to root it out and eliminate it. And then lastly, I just to finish, I wanted to mention, as part of your DEIA programs, Holocaust Remembrance Day is coming up. Have a speaker from the Holocaust Museum come and speak to your employees. We're doing that at K&L Gates, and have someone do that. They have a number of programs at the Holocaust Museum where they can come and speak to you about the Holocaust. Too many people are doubting the Holocaust. That is, I can't even fathom that, but yet you continue to see that, and that's a significant part of anti-Semitism. And so don't do that. Be the opposite, be the change. Make sure that people are remembering that at a time when it should be remembered. That's what DEIA committees are for, making sure that you're recognizing that the discrimination that's occurring and building a better world where everyone can be included. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you, Craig, and thanks to all of the panelists. I was going to wait to say this later, but since Craig just mentioned Holocaust Remembrance Day coming up, I will say that next Thursday, we do have a webinar coming up on Holocaust denial and erasive anti-Semitism. We'll be sending information out if you're on our list. But if you're not, keep an eye on the brandeiscenter.com website. And I think we can put up in the chat information for registering. I see it is now in the chat box. So now I'd like to invite my colleague Alyza Lewin, president of the Louis D. Brandeis Center, to join me in case she has questions or comments, as I know I have one that I'd like to start with. But at the same time, I would also like to acknowledge we have some questions that have already started coming in. And if you in the audience have questions, please feel free to bring them in now. So for all of our panelists, you've all acknowledged the problems of anti-Semitism in the corporate workplace and some of the challenges that employers are having. And we've been hearing this as well from people who reach out to us. Sometimes it's employment discrimination they're facing. Sometimes they're finding that they don't have support from the diversity, equity, and inclusion program, which I think echoes what we've heard from our speakers today. Sometimes they see that employee resource group or ERG opportunities are available for other groups, but not for Jewish employees. What I'd like to know, since all of you have worked with corporations in the past, is in your experience, what works? To the extent that you have urged or advised or counseled corporations to do a better job of addressing these problems, and they've agreed to do it. What is it that's worked? Why is it that some of them have done the right thing? What suggestions do you have?
I'll just kick it off and start. And again, I will do a disclaimer that this is just knowledge from the last couple of years. So this is something that we're still growing into, but I have found in a couple of places, and again, we have to be careful here too. I don't think that we should be coming in and demanding that we do anti-Semitism trainings in companies that don't even have established DE&I, and they've never even addressed racism or other issues. And all of a sudden, the very first thing that they're trying to address and deal with is anti-Semitism. It benefits to almost have a little bit of a broader framework and a broader umbrella to work with. We don't want to do a disservice in any way when we come in. But what has worked, because I have stories of what hasn't as well, but what has worked has often been when Jewish employees have been involved in some way, when they can point to instances where their company has put out something publicly about stopping Asian hate or about Black Lives Matter, and they never said anything when Jews were facing really heightened anti-Semitism, and Jews even in the company didn't feel safe or felt threatened or were asked questions about Israel in a way that the company probably never had dealt with before. And we usually start those conversations with the employees and they can kind of share their stories. And we do a session on understanding anti-Semitism for the employees first, the Jewish employees first, and they can kind of weigh in on that. And that's been effective. And then the other thing that we're finding to be quite effective, fortunately or unfortunately, is when there's been an incident, an actual unfortunate incident, like within the company. This is something that, we've even seen. We have a partnership right now with Lufthansa. They had an unfortunate incident that happened on one of their airlines where Jewish passengers were banned from flying, and that did set off a series of improvements in many ways, and being able to work with them on creating a module on understanding anti-Semitism for their employees to take now. And so that also has opened a door for learning and receptivity. And a lot of it is ignorance. And I know I always want to see the best in people. There's been a lot of ignorance out there. And as soon as you kind of have those conversations and you kind of show where you're addressing these issues in other minority communities, and you show the parallels, and you show where actually anti-Semitism as conspiratorial thinking is at the root of discrimination against other entities as well. And by knowing what anti-Semitism is, we actually can better fight anti-Black racism. We can better do these things. That helps bring them along. And so that trust building and relationship building part at first, Ken, is something that I found effective in the companies we've moved most forward with.
Excellent, thank you. Do any others want to add?
I would jump in as well. First, I still think most, not all, people want to do the right thing, and I'd go in with that premise. Number two, people need to know it's a problem. So sometimes it begins with educating. People could say, when you look at the status of Jews as a whole in the US, is it really a problem in 2023? If you look at the status of Jews in Germany in 1923, it was pretty golden. We don't need to wait. We can't afford to wait until it gets worse. And I think if people are open to learning, that's really important. Number three is, I think you want to make it as accessible as possible. I try not to say things are automatically anti-Semitic, but things that may be insensitive or a blind spot, so that someone can say, I hadn't seen that before, and that's a great opportunity. But to raise issues in a way that thinking, makes it most likely that someone will say, I want to listen, as opposed to get defensive. And then the fourth thing is, one option is to focus specifically on anti-Semitism, but the other is to integrate it. I remember after 9/11, we saw some ugly, by definition, Islamophobia. And we talked with clients, how do you integrate that into various things that you're doing? Well, right now, the house that's on fire is a Jewish house. So how do we integrate some of these issues? And sometimes it can be very little. I love the idea of having a speaker, a survivor. Sad how few are alive speak. But if something small, even a link to the Holocaust Museum from a leader and saying, this is important to our organization, it's important to me. When employees tell their DEI stories, if you're a leader and you haven't heard anyone Jewish tell their story, this would be a wonderful time for someone to tell their story. I had an opportunity recently, was surprised how much it made me feel connected with an organization. I lost most of my family in the Holocaust, and talking about it opened up a dialogue with someone about something in their history, and it enriched the connection, different histories, but common understanding. So I think sometimes the little things can go a long way in building the bigger bridges.
And then I would just add, I have to say, I don't see DEIA programs typically including religion and specifically typically including anti-Semitism. I do see training sometimes. It's rare. I feel that if you have sort of a robust training program that looks at anti-discrimination based on race or gender, you should include anti-Semitism, I would say. I think it's important. The EOC and OFCCP say it's growing. It's something that's fairly common. So it's something that should be addressed. The other thing I still see in popular culture, in the media, is referring to Jewish people as a group in a way that's more common than other groups, and almost, trying to convey some sort of characteristic about this group of individuals, which is extraordinarily diverse, politically, racially, in variety of ways. And like you said, even in terms of belief in God, very, very diverse group. And yet people feel like they can say generalities about Jewish people. And I see it more common. I see that happening more often. I always try to say something if I see that. And that's something that's important for training, that you should generally never, over generalities about groups is always problematic. And it eliminates the idea of the individual.
Thank you.
If I could just build on your question, because I want to go back to something that Holly had said in her original remarks, where she talked about how difficult it often seems for these organizations to actually use their own voice to call out and condemn the anti-Semitism when it happens. And it does seem that, calling out discrimination and harassment of just about any other group is viewed as standing up for civil and human rights. But when it's calling out harassment and discrimination of Jews, that's considered a political statement somehow. That's not considered standing up for civil and human rights. And one question that I have for this group is, how can we encourage these organizations to find that voice and to be able to actually call out and condemn the harassment and discrimination of Jews with the same forcefulness and the same strength that they use when they condemn harassment and discrimination of other groups?
Okay, if I jump in, thank you it's a great question. I also want to again thank the Brandeis Center. I would hope most organizations will have the moral conscience to want to do it. I know that's not the case always, but start there. I think sometimes explaining that sometimes the anti-Semitism is symptomatic of a more cultural rot, and that if you have it in your organization, the rot is not going to be limited to anti-Semitism. Not that anti-Semitism alone doesn't justify taking action for culture, but it won't. That's not the only problem you're going to have if you have anti-Semitism. And then I think there's a reality. There's legal liability here. This isn't just doing the right thing. This isn't just doing the inclusive thing. The failure to have an organization that is free of discrimination and harassment, in which there are reasonable accommodations, all as required by law, not giving legal advice as to specific factual situations, exposes an organization to liability and leaders to personal liability. And while I would hope that 1 and 2 might catch some leaders' attention, we see increased energy to where informal methods to raise Jewish concerns don't work, more formal litigation measures. You can come to either the table and talk about how to make an inclusive environment, or you may end up at the deposition table.
Excellent. We have about left in the hour, so I'm just going to throw out a bunch of things that have been raised, and you can comment on probably any one. So one audience member says, "This is fantastic. Please share the recording." Another says, I don't know. Everyone agree on that one?
Sure.
Okay, we have unanimity. I agree. Thank you. I agree. How do we include every group in initiatives? How can everybody be included? Another person asks, and this is maybe a variation on something that was just discussed, why is it in particular that employers feel that if they mention anti-Semitism, they have to mention Islamophobia as well? This doesn't apply to other groups. And another one says, we have a concern with DEI officers who are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. How can I succeed in getting a speaker without dealing with that sort of problem with DEI?
Yeah, in terms of Islamophobia, I mean, that's obviously a significant problem as well in this country. And there's a natural alliance there in terms of trying to prevent religious discrimination against those groups. Having said that, I've noticed the same thing. Typically, Islamophobia could be mentioned, and you don't necessarily have to mention anti-Semitism, but the other way around, there does seem to be a degree of pressure. And I think it comes from the misconception that, and I'm just telling you what I've observed, is that, a lot of the DEI movement focuses on marginalized groups. Now, Jewish people can be a marginalized group. Anytime you have to have police outside of your synagogue, there's a marginalizing aspect to that. And anytime you have to suffer or experience discrimination, that's marginalizing. That's what being a marginalized group is. But I think that there's a concept out there that Muslims or Islamic individuals are in a marginalized group, but that Jews are not. And I think that's why you see that disparity in treatment, but it shouldn't be that way. Any group that's discriminated against for purposes of DEI is a marginalized group.
Good, thank you.
Ken, I'll address one of the questions. I think it was directed toward me about including everyone. It was, I think, actually referring to how do we include all Jews, right? Jewish employees are such a diverse body, and I think when we especially think of maybe more progressive or even like anti-Zionist Jews in some of these spaces, what does that mean if they're to represent the Jewish community, and how do we bring those voices in but understand the majority as well? And I'll clarify a little bit when I said making sure that Jewish employees were on board, what I had said in my comments. And that's, American Jewish Committee, Jewish organizations coming in, we can go straight to the leadership, meet with them, come in and do a training and not really understand company culture and how we can make the most impact. And then we can leave and we have no necessarily idea of what we've just, if it's helped the employees or hurt the employees. And we want to make sure that the Jewish employees, there is a need for us to come in. They have questions, they have concerns, and we're helping meet those needs. But the question made me think of one thing else, but I do think it's important to talk about when we think about the diversity of the Jewish community and even Jews thinking differently about what is anti-Semitism and what is not. We try to use data, and I think we need more of it. We need to be pushing for more data of what's happening in the workplace, how American Jews are feeling about what the majority of Jews think about these issues. I've been in environments before where only an anti-Zionist Jew was allowed to speak at a D&I thing on anti-Semitism. Or there's been a time where some people in my organization weren't invited because they were white presenting Jews, and they weren't allowed to talk about anti-Semitism. Only a Jew of color could speak, and that something's off there when only someone who's of color can then have that intersection to speak about anti-Semitism. And so this is where we need to say, this is the majority of Jews in America are think this way. Or we know that from Pew that 8 in 10 American Jews say that 80% of American Jews say Israel is important or essential to what being Jewish means to them. And I don't necessarily think companies know that or are aware of that. So we can keep presenting that information that helps in those spaces as well.
Excellent. In the last minute, I do want to take a prerogative to make one last point, which is that I think more than one of you made an excellent argument that if employers are addressing a race, ethnicity, and gender, they should also include religious discrimination, including Jews and anti-Semitism, and that's 100% correct. It's also true, however, that if they're going to effectively address race and national origin, then anti-Semitism has to be addressed regardless of whether they're looking at religion or not. As the Supreme Court held in Shari Tefillah versus Cobb, Jews are protected under laws addressing racial discrimination. This was echoed as recently as last week in a message from the Biden administration's Office for Civil Rights. So regardless of whether a corporation is ready to do the right thing on religious employees generally, it can't be effective and inclusive in addressing ethnicity and race without protecting all groups under that umbrella. And that surely includes Jewish Americans as other groups. At any rate, I do want to thank again my colleague, other colleagues who worked on putting this together, including Scott Pirro and our outstanding panelists today. And just remind all of you that next week on Thursday, we will have a webinar on Holocaust denial and erasive anti-Semitism. I thank you all. Take care.
Thank you for what you do.